Hello, BookTube. Recently, Kevin Towle at Kevin Towle Reads did another one of his thought videos, his discussion starter videos. He picks these old and well-worn subjects that are still evergreen in their interest, just always fascinating, and raises them again, and, and has a whole bunch of opinions on them, but is perfectly happy to hear your opinions and maybe change his own. I love these sorts of things, and I especially love the topic that he raised recently. I'll leave a link to his video down below, which is the old subject of book to movie adaptations. And here for movie, let's preempt the whole clarification thing uh, by saying that when we're talking about movies here, we're talking about any adaptation right to the screen. So a multi-part streaming series, a streaming movie that never went to theaters. That anything like that we can just lump under the heading of movies. Since the COVID-19 pandemic, we pretty much have to do that. Uh, and he had a whole bunch of examples of examples in his mind of adaptations to movie adaptations that actually improved on their original books, or ones that didn't, and why. And of course, this is an old subject on my channel. I have been saying for years, I have been getting a lot of flack for years from a lot of you about my what I think is a common sense contention that the movie version of a book is almost always an improvement on the original, largely because most books stink like meat left out in the sun, but also secondarily because even the ones that don't stink aren't great all the way through. there's there's flab, there's filler, there's even Homer nods, as we're told, and even an author who doesn't have that much deficiency is still going to have. Authors are all coke snorting egomaniacs, so they're always going to be in love with the sound of their own voice. They're always going to have long baroque filigrees in the book that doesn't belong there, but they insist they'll fight any editor to keep it. So the ultimate person who suffers from that is you, the reader, and that's because these things they come from one person, and that one person has so much monomaniacal control over the product that some writers are delusional enough to think that they can dictate how you receive it even after you've bought it, even after it's gone out into the world, which is lunacy. And yet, plenty of big name authors do that. Plenty of them do. Say, oh, this character, by the way, I meant to say this about them. Well, you should have said that in the book, because right now, it's no more canon if you say it than it is if I say it. Uh, I think that it just stands to reason that most movie adaptations of books are better than the originals. But we'll go over Kevin's picks, good and bad, before we get to some examples of mine. I've given a million examples on this channel over time, but for good examples, he mentioned Liam Neeson as Lawrence Block's Matthew Scudder, and I agree. I don't think that Liam Neeson is physically right for Scudder, and we're going to be getting to that with some of my own choices. But he's great; he can do no wrong. So, and the series is really thoughtfully done. Kevin Towle also mentions Jurassic Park, Steven Spielberg's adaptation of Michael Crichton's novel. Jurassic Park, which is pretty much a textbook example of what I'm talking about. Jurassic Park is clunky, self-impressed, weirdly incel in a lot of ways, in ways that Michael Crichton never actually outgrew. Jurassic Park is the movie is absolutely brilliant. So, yeah, there's a whole bunch of stuff in the novel Jurassic Park that is not in the movie, and that is not developed well in the novel, so why would you miss it? He mentions Alan Ritchson as Jack Reacher, Lee Child's character Jack Reacher, which is great. That series is terrific, and Alan Ritchson is a whole lot more convincing than Tom Cruise in the role, at least physically. I find it hard to believe. People always rag on Cruise. Cruise is 5 feet tall, and Reacher is 7 feet tall. So it's weird casting right there physically. But I always smile a little when Reacher aficionados say that, yeah, Tom Cruise is horribly miscast as Jack Reacher. It's totally wrong. But then you watch the movies. Say what you want about Tom Cruise, and I've said a lot in print over the years, over the decades. He is a movie star, a genuine movie star. And when you're watching his Reacher movies, you don't care how short he is. I maintain you don't care that he's not physically like the character he's playing, because he can do anything on the screen. He can command. You're caught up in him on the screen. You don't care anymore. Nevertheless, it is much more enjoyable just on a relax your brain level to have a Jack Reacher who is believably horrifying, who is believably Sasquatch. And Kevin Towle also mentions The Shawshank Redemption, which is a famous movie adapting a short story by Stephen King. Now, because Kevin Towle is, I believe, has one toe firmly dabbling in the pool of Dude Bro, he has to make the usual mouth noises about how it's a great adaptation of a story that is still great. The story is terrible. Absolutely terrible. Horribly, horribly strained and self-impressed. Look at me, Ma. Look at how clever I am. The movie isn't any of those things. The movie is actually brilliant. So I agree with the choice. I just don't agree with the lip service that we have to pay to this crappy, crappy author before we praise what somebody else did with his work. The one thing listed by Kevin Towle in his list of good examples of adaptation is bewildering to me. And that is the Peter Jackson 3-movie adaptation of J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit, which until Amazon's The Rings of Power, and we'll be getting back to that, until Amazon's The Rings of Power premiered, I routinely called Peter Jackson's Hobbit movies abominations. They're just awful. They're just awful in so many ways. And when you think about Peter Jackson's King Kong movie, you realize what kind of pure magic he can compress into one movie. Into a movie that you sit down, doesn't have an intermission, doesn't have 2 sequels, you just sit down and watch it. My heart breaks every time I think about the Hobbit movies. I would never rewatch them. But my heart breaks every time I think about them, thinking what an unbelievably charming and pitch-perfect movie Jackson could have made of those things if the studio overlords had not said, no, we need a trilogy, we need a 6-disc box set, we need extras, we need to sell toys. I always think about the visual that somebody put up on Twitter years ago of what's her name, the elf badass woman in the Hobbit movies, who is lamenting the death of a dwarf super hottie, and she looks up at her father and says, "Why does it hurt so much?" Because in the movie she's lamenting because she's immortal. But yet she's fallen in love, and when the person that she's in love with dies, she looks up at her father and says, "Why does it hurt so much?" And the line that was underneath the visual on Twitter was, "Because it's not in the books." I agree with that completely. They're horrible. I don't know what Kevin Towle was thinking. But we'll move on to his examples of bad adaptations, because that's much more of what I do. Like, for instance, he mentions Tom Cruise is a bad adaptation of Jack Reacher. Now, I believe that's true. Tom Cruise he doesn't do threatening well. He's the aforementioned 5 feet tall in pumps. So as Reacher on the screen, yeah, he's got a lot of topspin that you're working against. I don't believe it ends up mattering in the movies. I think that Tom Cruise just carries them on the strength of sheer magnetism. Which, Alan Ritchson's a heck of a nice guy. He's a heck of a nice, infectiously optimistic presence on set, which Tom Cruise is not always. Let's just put it that way. But he doesn't have a tenth of that magnetism. That's what makes you a movie star, is when you have that, where you're just dying to know what happened, what this person does next. That's not true with Alan Ritchson, but I guess he is. I just don't think I wouldn't nominate Tom Cruise's Reacher as a bad adaptation. Then Kevin Towle once again is hoist by his own petard because he has to bring up Stephen King. All these King bros on BookTube, oh my God, I feel so sorry for all of them because they can't admit that he's just awful. Instead, when he comes into conversation, they just have to feverishly move the goalposts. But he mentions Matthew McConaughey in Dark Tower. And here, it's the usual verbiage about how the Dark Tower books are great except when they're not. I would want here to point out the obvious, which is that they're always bad. It's not they're great except when they're not. It's that they're never great. They never even come close to being good. They're just cobbled together cheese. But even so, apart from the word service, I agree. I don't know that Matthew McConaughey knew where he was in that adaptation. It's downright confusing. He can be brilliant on screen. He has something like that kind of Tom Cruise level magnetism, but I don't know what that adaptation was at all, not in the slightest. And then to round out his bad list, Kevin Towle mentions two very headline-grabbing, multi-million-dollar, in one case billion-dollar, property adaptations that were done on streaming services. He mentions The Rings of Power, which adapts or seeks to adapt Robert Jordan's series, and does a largely bad job of it, mainly by changing the source material. And then he mentions Amazon's The Rings of Power, which we'll be getting to. I'll give you my own list now, and we'll be getting to that. But let's just say I agree. Rings of Power could be a lot better. There are things in it that I really liked, but it could be a lot better if it were a little less sold on itself. And Rings of Power we will be getting to. But then I want to give you mine. And I'll start with my list of good adaptations. And here I could say, you name it. You name it, and the adaptation is better than the original. I mean, I always mention things like Ben-Hur, which has been adapted many, many times. Was probably the first adaptation of a book to a movie ever done. Try reading the book. Oh my God. Oh my God. But if we want to move forward from older things like Ben-Hur, there are a whole bunch of other examples that I could come up with. Oh my God, a whole bunch of them. But if we want to move examples forward, another example that I always give is The Hunt for Red October, which is an absolutely fantastic movie made from a turgid, overwritten, underdramatic, over-explaining, exposition dumpy book. A big, clunky, awful book. The best thing that Tom Clancy ever wrote, but that's still not saying much. It's still a guy who had no business writing dramatic prose, who should have been writing nonfiction accounts or something like that about the state of naval readiness or the state of the Cold War navies facing each other on the top or the bottom of the world. He should have been doing dispatches or something like that. Instead, he wrote this book. And the movie fixes almost everything that's in it. So it's a perfect example. Another example that I might give, it stings a little because I actually like the book. Cornelius Ryan's book, A Bridge Too Far, is history. It doesn't purport to be fiction. It's history. I think that it's really good. I think it really holds up to a reread, but there's no denying the fact that the drama and the pathos of everything that Ryan was writing in his book is done infinitely better in the movie. I don't think there's any, if I cannot deny that, and I'm a fan of the book, I don't see how anyone else could deny it. And I might also, in my list of goods, I would gladly second Shawshank Redemption. A perfect example of a director and a cast making a silk purse out of a sow's ear. They took largely garbage source material and made something really good out of it, largely by seeing all sorts of things that the author didn't see, drawing all sorts of connections that the author didn't connect, getting rid of all the self-indulgences that the author insists on. What are you doing up there? You just stretching? Hi, baby. Do you want to come down on the couch? Or maybe cross over to the chair? Your chair? Oh goodness. Oh goodness. Oh goodness. Are you going to jump over there? Go ahead, Frida. You can do it. Yes, you did it. Sorry, a little bit of dog drama there. Where were we? Oh, right. Then we come to my bad examples. And here it's a shorter list because I think most adaptations do improve on their originals, but it's still a list. There's still plenty of examples in there. I could come up with a few that are bad only because of how much they leave out of the original, especially if the original is successful. If the original is really good at what it does, you don't want to leave out anything. So think about the Brad Pitt adaptation of World War Z. World War Z, the single greatest novel ever written by a human being. And the movie, no. No, the movie has some very good visuals at parts. The visuals are largely drowned out, as is almost everything else in the movie, by that scarf. If you've seen the movie, you know what I'm talking about. Brad Pitt has a giant burnoose that he wears throughout the movie. I have no idea why. It wasn't the costuming department. It wasn't the costuming department. Anyone who's risen to the level of professionalism in costuming necessary to be on a Brad Pitt vehicle is smart enough to know in one round of dailies what that thing is doing in the movie and get rid of it. They're smart enough to know that. A thing like that had to be Brad Pitt himself. Movie doesn't get made without him. It had to be him saying, I want this. I don't know the lore or the oral history behind that scarf, but it all but steals the movie in a bad way. And is there any doubt that a faithful adaptation of World War Z would have been better? I imagine a long series, a cable series that does World War Z real justice. Oh, I imagine that. I imagine how wonderful it would be. Mark Forster just didn't do a good job with that movie. There are effective visuals, but another one would be Felix van Groningen adapted Beautiful Boy, a memoir of a father losing his son to drug addiction, and that is a tried and true Hollywood staple. And Steve Carell shows up for the movie and tries his best to be vulnerable and flinty and bewildered, but what are you going to do when your co-star is Timothée Chalamet acting with a capital A, all in italics? When Timothée Chalamet is going for an Oscar, there's nothing that can save the movie. and so there's a case where, for all I know, as much as I would be able to determine, the movie's adaptation of the book was okay. It's just like with the scarf, and Timothée Chalamet is kind of like a big floofy scarf. It was totally drowned out, just completely lost in this horrible performance. But a couple of TV adaptations that I should close with, because I don't want to go on forever and ever about this, especially since I want to know your opinions. One TV adaptation, it's painful to me. It bewilders me. I'm not going to excoriate it like I am the other, because I think it's just a series of bad decisions that could almost entirely be solved by changing around the casting. You don't even have to hire anybody. Just give different parts to different people. That's all. And I think you'd do just fine. And that is the BBC production of Wolf Hall, the adaptation of Hilary Mantel's novel, which is torpedoed, I think, by its casting. Damian Lewis as Henry VIII, I don't understand him anyway. I don't understand. I've yet to triangulate on what a director needs to do to get an actually effective performance out of him. Some directors can, but whoever was on set for Rings of Power, or not for Rings of Power, for Wolf Hall, he's acting like he's playing Henry VIII, which is not the same thing as playing Henry VIII. There's a remove between him and you that should not be there. It's deadly in scenes where Henry is trying to be charismatic and hale and well met, and even worse when he's trying to be threatening. You're not going to feel this character as threatening if you feel like Damian Lewis is just acting. And that's what happens all throughout the show. That's what happens. You don't ever feel it. And that's nothing compared to the main casting. And this just kills me. Mark Rylance is cast as Thomas Cromwell. And that is just flatly on its face wrong. Not only is it wrong physically, Rylance is too old for the part. He looks like a cancer patient who's hiding his IV stand the whole course of the thing, when that is the exact opposite of Thomas Cromwell, who is this clenched fist of thuggish power. Not only is he way too old for the part, which leads me to think that he got it through heavy campaigning, because the last people who ever know that they're too old for the part are actors. But also he plays it wrong. His Cromwell is thready and soft-spoken and ghostly. He appears out of soft corners. He never raises his voice. And that doesn't work. That absolutely doesn't work at all. Now, you could do dream casting for a cable production of Wolf Hall. You could do dream casting that would work really, really well. I think. What I wouldn't give to see Bob Hoskins in his prime as Cromwell. Oh my. But even so, in the cast of the show, you could, in the supporting cast, find someone who could play Cromwell better. And who should have. And I myself think, no offense at all to King Theoden, but I think that Rylance would have been perfect as the Duke of Norfolk. But instead, the Plum role went to him, and it shouldn't have. It ruins the whole show. Also, I think the showrunners were being a little too literal. The book is great, so you would think that I would prefer that, but they were being a little too literal, which has two results. One is that some scenes just seem to come out of nowhere because they're grounded in the book, but they're not. The showrunners don't take any trouble to ground them in reality in the show itself. Like, for instance, there's a whole bit of business in the book about Cardinal Wolsey demanding cherries and lettuce out of season. There's a whole bit of business about that, and it's not that funny, but it is personal. It shows a bit of their relationship with each other. He gets a tray of cherries in the show and makes a quip about it. You have no idea what it means. If you haven't read the book, you have no idea what it means. Same thing with in the book. There's a wonderful little flashback that Cromwell has where he remembers working in his father's blacksmithy, and when a spark would hit you, there was no avoiding the pain, but his father taught him a trick. Cross your hands above your head. He said it fools the pain. It allows you to master it long enough for you to put a salve on it. And at one point, when Henry is yelling at Cromwell later in the book, Cromwell does that, and it confuses Henry and stops him from yelling. And it's moderately effective in the book. I guess it's not one of the more effective things that Hilary Mantel does, because if Henry VIII, the real Henry VIII, were in your face yelling down at you at the top of his lungs about how you're overstepping, and you did this to him, first of all, his guards would kill you before you could get your hands halfway to your shoulders. But even if they weren't around and you had your hands up like that, he'd knock you to the ground. Himself, personally, he'd knock you to the ground. He wouldn't stand back and go, "Oh, what's that?" So it's made a little bit passable in the book because how well Hilary Mantel writes it, but it's lost in the show, along with many other things. That's one way, and another way is that they're too faithful to the book is that they include every single character. You can't include every single character. You can't have just 30 people in a scene and you're supposed to know who they all are and keep them straight. No. It's all just, it's a muddle it breaks my heart because obviously the good intentions were there. And that brings us to a TV adaptation where there are no good intentions, where there are only evil intentions, not even clueless intentions, evil intentions. And that is, of course, Amazon's The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power. I have now just completed watching the second season, and it is a travesty. It ought to ensure that anyone connected with it in any way never works in the industry again. It ought to ensure that. It ought to make some sort of cinematic history. Not just for what one Twitter commentator said about it 2 years ago, which is that this is, in fact, for future reference, what it looks like if you set $1 billion on fire. Not just for that, but for the fact that the inept changes that are being made here are not the same as Wolf Hall. The showrunners of Wolf Hall, maybe Mark Rylance did campaign for the role of Thomas Cromwell, and maybe the showrunners thought, well, he's not right, he's too thin, he looks sickly, he's too old, but he is one of the greatest actors in the world, and we want this thing to have heft. So let's do that. Maybe they thought that. And if they did, can any of us say that in that position we might have thought otherwise? I don't know. Don't know that I would have weighed one against the other and decided no. There you can at least impute good intentions. With the Rings of Power, you can only impute evil intentions. This show is made by people who don't just not know Tolkien, but they hate the idea of him. This is an abomination in every way. In every way that a show can be. There are no little hidden pockets of quality. The visuals are terrible and inconsistent. The costuming is cheap. A good community theater in Wisconsin would have better costumes. The acting is all terrible, even from a handful of actors who can do good work when they're not trapped in this morass. there is no fidelity to the original source material, not even close, not even in spirit. The pacing, the blocking, the timing, the acting, the dialogue, everything, the lighting, all of it is bad. Every single little bit of it is bad, including the climax of the second season. I don't want to spoil it. I don't know that the climax has come out yet. Just the Rings of Power stands and will stand forever as the quintessence of what can go wrong with adapting a beloved work of literature to a plastic medium. And it didn't go wrong by chance. It was attacked by the showrunners who hate Tolkien and know what messages they want. They know what political messages they wanted to advance. They didn't care about the source material at all. And they have been roundly brochetted for it. And torn apart in media, torn apart by audience reactions, torn apart by Tolkien fans, to the point where the so-called Tolkien professor just recently had to come out and say, well, you know, there really isn't a Tolkien canon. I mean, he was tinkering around with this stuff until the day he died. So who's to say that the elves don't owe their immortality and life force to trees? Who's to say that Mithril wasn't created by an elf fighting a Balrog and then molten liquid pouring into the roots of trees? Who's to say that didn't happen? Who's to say that the Rings of Power weren't forged first and overtake their owners and make them slaves of Sauron, even though, well, who's to say that didn't happen? Tolkien says that doesn't happen. Tolkien says that Gandalf is not a wizard in the Second Age. Tolkien says there are no hobbits in the Second Age. Tolkien says a lot of things about this in the source material that these showrunners paid $1 billion to access. They didn't care. And they're not going to care going forward. There's no way that this show is going to be canceled, even though it's losing Amazon bucket loads of money. That the Tolkien professor had to come forward and say, well, you know, it's not really that bad because there really isn't any such thing as an Amazon, as a Tolkien canon. So really, these showrunners are free to do what they want. I'm sure that the electronically inclined out there in the world, I don't know that the idea has occurred to them, but I'm sure that the electronically inclined young people out in the world would have no trouble accessing the Tolkien professor's online financing. And I just wonder if that online financing has had a boost somewhere. A pool that's been paid for, college tuition that's been paid off, a medical bill that's been taken care of. For someone who claims to know Tolkien or literature at all to say that no, these things aren't canon because the author was thinking about them for the rest of his life. Second season is now over. Fans absolutely hated it, and more importantly, it lost 90% of its audience after the second season, after the second episode. So no one's watching this show except the people who are hating it. There are no knock-on benefits. There are no merchandising or anything like that. No one wants it. No one's going to buy it when it comes out on DVD or Blu-ray or anything like that. The primary emotion this is generating is exactly the primary emotion it was supposed to generate: hatred on the part of fans. This is fan baiting, raised to an art form. And Amazon doesn't care. Amazon has enough money to burn it on a project they know everyone hates. God forbid that. So now, as I've said on this channel a few times, forever and ever, those of us growing up in the age when special effects were expensive, we would always daydream about our favorite things being made into movies. Wouldn't that be awesome? Wouldn't it be awesome if there was a Fantastic Four movie? Wouldn't it be awesome if there was an adaptation of Dragon Riders of Pern or something like that? Now, in 2024, in the 21st century, it's the worst fate that can befall a property that you love. This is going to happen to it. It's going to become the Rings of Power. It's the worst fate that can befall. Now you pray that your favorite thing will not be adapted. Whether it's Essex Dogs or The Lord of the Rings itself, which is coming in our lifetime. Remember, you heard it on this channel first, a black lesbian Gandalf. If he can be a wizard in the Second Age, it's what Tolkien was thinking, right? Yeah, when on his deathbed, he was probably thinking that hobbits shouldn't be shorter than anybody else because that's really ableist, and that maybe Gandalf should be a woman. He was really thinking that. Anyway, sorry. I don't want to degenerate this into a rant. That is a very brief response to Kevin Towle's video, one of his latest thought-provoking videos about some subject that's connected with books. And of course, I want to know from you not all of you have watched all my other videos on this subject. What do you think of this subject? Are you one of those people that ironclad holds to the idea that the book is always better? Can you not think of any examples where that's true? Are you even going to hold to that in Harry Potter or Percy Jackson? Or are you, probably most of you are in the middle, or are you closer to my end saying that most of the time the adaptation is better? Unless the adaptation is remarkably flawed in some way, it will be better. I'm wondering where you stand on the subject. Let me know. I'll leave a link to Kevin's video down below, but I'm going to wrap this up for now before I start ranting some more about the Rings of Power. But I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.